Good morning, and thank you for joining me here today for Morning Buzz. I'm Adam Eisen, Membership Director of the One Club for Creativity and your host. We've just returned from 2 amazing weeks in Puerto Rico, where some of our One Show juries met to deliberate. And yesterday, we wrapped on all in-person judging in New York for the remaining One Show disciplines and ADC juries. With just some virtual juries wrapping up, all that's left is to sit on pins and needles as we await the results this May during Creative Week in New York City. It's May 15th through 19th. And by the way, tickets are on sale now at creativeweek.com. And as always, members receive extra special pricing. So in the meantime, we'll keep fresh new episodes of Morning Buzz coming at you. Today, we'll hear about cultural MacGyverism, and yes, we'll all learn what exactly that means. And then we'll meet an incredible creative who is pioneering design through code. I promise you'll want to see her work and hear her story, so stick around. Throughout the episode, we want to hear from you. Be sure to say hello in the chat, offer up any of your support, and chime in with your questions. We do see them, and I'll make sure they get asked, so be sure to speak up. Without further ado, I'm honored to welcome to the show Harsh Kapadia, Executive Vice President and Chief Creative Officer of MRM, who'll tell us all about how cultural MacGyverism unlocks diversity's full power. Hey, Harsh, how are you?
Hi, how you doing? Thanks for having
Good.
me.
Welcome to the show. Thank you for being here, especially on your vacation in Mexico. It's so great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Awesome. Cool. Well, it looks like you're ready to go. So I'm going to hand things over and I'll pop back on at the end to help with some Q&A.
Thank you. So before we get started, cultural MacGyverism is something that has been brewing on my mind for a while now, and only recently figured out how to coin this term. But it was originally influenced by the show MacGyver, and I don't know how many of you know the show MacGyver. It was actually even before my time. But a friend of mine introduced me to the show MacGyver in Australia. And, the show defines MacGyver, who's almost the opposite of James Bond, if you will. Angus MacGyver is a secret agent for a national security agency that solves complicated missions with his broad knowledge of applied sciences and his favorite Swiss Army knife. But in a nutshell, when you actually look at the show, MacGyver's always in trouble. He always gets trapped. He always gets cornered by the baddies, if you will. And, he always has his Swiss Army knife and something else that he'll use together to get out of any situation. He doesn't have his Aston Martin. He doesn't have explosives. He doesn't have, the swagger that Bond is shown to have, but he has his own charm and swagger in how he gets out of these situations. And, the more I started binge watching some of these shows, I started realizing in our creative industry, we do have an opportunity to be cultural MacGyvers. As the conversation around diversity keeps going up, the convo was more about diverse individuals versus having diverse mindsets come together. And that's where cultural MacGyverism really starts playing a role. If you go back just a few years, if you start from where the pandemic was, and I'm sure we're all tired of hearing about the pandemic, but if you just go back and look at some of the creativity that came out in the initial stages of the pandemic, it was the sea of sameness. In fact, in some of the ads or some of the communication, you even saw the same footage, the same images. It was the first time in at least my lifetime we saw a universal or a global equalizer where every creative person was almost, at the same blank canvas, was staring at the same blank wall, was getting the exact same brief, but from different brands and products. And the output of that, with the limitations that were handed to us with the pandemic, the result almost came out to be the same. And to me, that's when cultural MacGyverism, or using influences of different cultures, became more prominent than ever. I think it's always been prominent, but the pandemic really spotlights this need to have, even post-pandemic. In a post-pandemic era, we are going to get in by so many things. Behaviors are going to change. don't look at diversity in isolation, but look at mixing up cultures is going to be really important. And while we look at building diverse workforces, I think it's important to find the MacGyvers in our organization that are really going to help us bring all these diverse thinkers together. Because the difference in cultures that we're looking for is not easy for any organization to let it mix on its own. You need people who are willing, you need individuals who are willing to take, absorb, and mix and actually make sense out of it, and influence the basis of creativity based on those differences. You know, um, the very difference comes from, my personal journey has been growing up in India. So I'm heavily influenced by the Indian culture from Mumbai. But then also my wife's from Calcutta. So, two very different cultures. There's always a constant cultural mix going on there. Few years of living in Australia, I was lucky enough to absorb quite a bit of Aussie culture. Some of my closest friends there are actually Australian who were born and brought up there. As common as that might sound, if you think about it from an immigrant mindset, when you go out and live in other countries, your subconscious state will always have you attract to the people who come from the same home countries. And as a creative, it's always been on the top of my mind to actually break out of the comfort zone and actually get to know others, get to know people and their cultures, not just them as individuals, but what did they grow up on? And following Australia, I came to the US. Again, US is such a varied market between, even East Coast, Middle America, and the West Coast. They're very different sets of people or groups of people, and every state has its own identity. In fact, even the laws in America are different in each state. There is quite a bit of good complexity that exists that you can actually take and turn that into beautiful ideas or powerful ideas. And my journey then also took me to the UK, which is a completely different market. When you even look at how the UK works and the rest of Europe works, when you look at the local market versus the regional market. And, one of the things I also noticed while doing this was if you actually start applying different cultures, and in my case, between India, Australia, the US, and the UK, when someone says something can't be done, there is always a way it can be done. Right. And I tap into, sometimes my Indian roots on no is never really an answer. There's always someone waiting to figure it out, or, my shorthand of when I was in Australia, everyone would say, we're too far away. Nobody's looking. Let's just take the chances and do what we need to do to make something amazing, or in America, there's always a way to figure it out. Right. Or in the UK where, cultural heritage and pushing that into modernity is really rooted and grounded. The things that are said at the pub actually are part of culture. And so between all these things, you can see how this can become really interesting. When you are talking to clients and brands who may not have reinvented their products or services in years, but need something new to say, as creatives, and I've been guilty of this, of always asking in the brief, what's new news and what's the new thing to say? And sometimes you just don't. But what keeps shifting around these brands and services is the culture. Or how do you apply the cultures you've grown up in, or the teams that have come from external influences to create something new? One of the examples I had was, when I worked in one of the countries and there was a brief that was very specific, be grounded in the culture of that country. The debate became, do we put on a team that's always locally grown there or grown up there and understands and knows the culture better, or an immigrant team that may be new to the culture? And my hypothesis was we should actually mix both of them, because the team that's come from the outside and hasn't yet been deep rooted in culture will find something, an idea, an insights in something that's taken for granted by the local team. And the local team will look for something that's more very nuanced and might be more part of current pop culture. But the ideas that come back could really be really simple, but influence our heartstrings on how did we not see that coming. This cultural insight or this behavior has been in front of us all this time. Kudos to the brand to tap into this. And I'm talking through the lens of marketing, But I don't think cultural MacGyverism is restricted or limited to just marketing, to be honest. I think it could change the way companies work. It could change the way we all behave. And it could also empower curiosity. As we grow older, our schooling system actually destroy our ability to be creative at large. And what if cultural MacGyverism becomes your excuse to continue to be curious, to break out of the rules that you were once taught in the schooling systems that we grew up in? In just simple things like when I first moved to the US, and I remember, there was a designer that was working some long hours. In our industry, we do sometimes tend to work long hours. And I just told him, the project's over, just take a day in lieu, take the day off. And the response was, I don't need a day off. And I was like, no, you just need to switch off. This is not annual leave. This is just take a day off. And that's when I noticed the cultural differences between American work culture and Aussie work culture was so different, and I had to say, well, I need you to take time off, not for yourself, but for me, because I need you to be charged emotionally and mentally with curiosity. So if you don't want to take the day off, go ahead to the museum for a day, but I need you to step away from the work. And that suddenly became okay. But still, I got the weird look of, what do you mean I'm taking a day in lieu? And if as creative people, we can't have a space in our mind to think, how are we going to keep reinventing and re-innovating? But even just that simple behavior on how the two cultures work differently when it comes to a balance. There's a lot of discussions around work-life balance and work-life melding and mixing, but the brain needs time to think. And I think sometimes when we take influences from other cultures, we might see how we can shape the cultures at our workplaces as well, just not in creativity. The other part I would also think about is, how do you actually, as a MacGyver or cultural MacGyver, embrace the mind meld of teams? On one hand, you have your own ideas, you have your own ways of working. On the other hand, your job is to actually listen to inputs from all places, but then be the concoctionist, if you will, to mix those cultures and make sense of it. And I don't think you have to go extreme to one culture or the other. I think it's about taking the base culture of the country you're in and then peppering it with, the right cultures that might reinvent or re-innovate the ideas. That people say there are no new ideas out there. Every idea has been done. That's not true. I don't believe in that. There's always a new idea to be done. And what that idea could mean, put in the right context or a different context, can really change the impact of that idea or the meaning of that idea. And if the meaning of the idea changes, you are onto something new. So this is where, when we look at MacGyverism and leadership, it's part listening, part having the ability to connect the dots between all your teams, because hiring diversity isn't about the individual. We need to make it about the leaders that can MacGyver the opportunity to get them out of impossible briefs, right? This is not about, oh, we've given somebody a chance, we've given somebody an opportunity. We have to look at cultural MacGyverism as an excuse to be selfish about diverse hires or building diverse teams. Now, it comes with a very wide spectrum. It could be from the cultures they grew up in. It could be socioeconomical backgrounds. It could be people who haven't only lived in our industries. Sometimes an outsider might not have every single buzzword that we need or we are used to hearing, and we could avoid buzzword bingo within our meetings and conversations and actually come back with some ideas that might be observations, but it is upon the cultural MacGyverism, MacGyverizer, the leader, to actually set that person up for success. It's not for them to figure out the way how to navigate the system, because we've created our own complex systems and our own expectations on how an idea is brought to life, or how an idea is made, or what an idea should be, or what a process should be, and there needs to be a champion / bulldozer that allows for breaking of that process and relooking at that process as well. What some of the other examples that I wanted to touch on when it comes to cultural MacGyverism was, how do you really spell out the context and drop it in there? I recently saw a piece of work in one of my jury duties for judging award shows, was the Tough Turban, which came out of Canada, and it was talking about empowering the Sikh community to be able to ride the Harley Davidson. Now, the way I saw that piece of work was, Harley Davidson has its own challenges in the audience it reaches. There is a stereotype of who rides a Harley Davidson. And what I loved about what this team came back with is they found nothing new in Harley Davidson, nothing new in the bike itself, nothing new in the brand itself. But what they realized was, how do you open up the reason or the need to talk about the bike to a different audience? And if anyone who knows, the Sikh community actually wears a turban, which means it's impossible to wear a helmet. And, while on one hand, the idea may have been about safety, what I found really fascinating and interesting was they empowered a religion to be able to pursue their passion of riding a bike. Because if you ride a bike with your turban on and no helmet, you're definitely getting pulled over by the cops for not wearing a helmet and not following the law, let alone you getting into an accident and hurting yourself. And creating, a system where your turban, your religious headwear becomes the helmet as a protective gear, to me, I saw that as they just empowered a community who at one point had to decide between holding on to their religious identity or wearing a helmet that, one, protected them in the event of an accident, but also protected them from getting pulled over or fined, right? And to me, that was a classic play of cultural MacGyverism, where they found a cultural insight and found a community that may not have originally been part of a brief or part of what you call your expected audience segment, right? Now, that is just one example. Could Harley Davidson be looking at other aspects of people who might not be able to ride bikes because of various other reasons? In this case, it was headwear. In another case, it could be completely different, and keep expanding its audience, right? And this is where looking at the audiences differently could really play a role. I mean, if you look at just any of these countries, where if I was to move to another country, I'm not only trying to apply the principles of what's in that country or the one country. I mean, sometimes I think I no longer think as, just as growing up in India. My mind actually is melded now in working across the 4 continents I worked in and the styles of people I worked in. That's another thing I've also learned is it's not just about the diverse teams leaders build, it's also the diverse influences we might get as leaders. So for me personally, I've always found mentors in very diverse forms and diverse ways and very different working styles, and how I almost have a choice selfishly to make it a buffet of leadership qualities I can pick and choose from the different people I follow to shape the leadership style I want of myself. And to me, that's not just of what you see in the meeting room, but that comes back to cultural MacGyverism as well, because you can actually see someone else either succeeding or not succeeding, and you get to decide what type of qualities they want to pick up and not pick up. There's tons of articles out there that talk about good leadership, but I've always learned observing someone in a workplace or observing someone's experiences always teaches you more than anything else. And I think that's why the whole philosophy of cultural MacGyverism is so broad. I would encourage to anyone to take the principles of it and apply it or reapply it based on your own teams or your own personal experiences. It just doesn't, it's not limited to countries, it's not limited to religion, it's not limited to even just socioeconomic backgrounds. It could be related to how you switched industries and how different industries are, how different industries work. And when you start mashing up different processes, you actually start getting different creative results, right? And creativity can only keep happening when people see something different. if people are seeing something expected, if people are seeing something they're used to over years, it becomes a systemic problem. It becomes an autopilot. And cultural MacGyverism allows us to step out of being in autopilot all the time. I think it's really important for us as individuals, as organizations, as leaders, to constantly be reinventing ourselves based on how our workforces get built, how our clients are trying to enter different markets, different cultures, and appeal to different people. And I think we're just at the starting point on how we tap into this. At the moment, we're still in this infancy stage of, we've started with casting in some ads, and we put that as our watchouts, and we look at, are all the pictures being broad enough in all our decks, and are we talking about things in a diverse way? But I think the true potential will get unpacked when can really play with culture and mix culture. You always have to be careful. Will you offend a culture when you mix and match out of someone else? But the more just like my family, who's everyone's from law, just like they say, once you know the law, you can play with it, right? And similarly, once you understand and know different cultures, subconsciously, you will start mixing and matching it for the right reasons at the right time. I think context is really, really important for cultural MacGyverism as a philosophy to actually play a role. Now, I know I've been talking quite a bit as well, and sometimes it's tricky to just do a one-way conversation when it has to do with cultural MacGyverism, because there's no one fixed rule. There is no one fixed formula. I can talk about my personal experiences and how I use cultural MacGyverism, to hopefully try and open up the aperture at MRM or in any workplace in how we work. If I look at how a lot of my creative department comes from a very mixed culture, and often they are mashed up together. And when I say mixed culture, I don't just mean race. I don't just mean geographic influences. I also mean, the type of thinking they have, or the disciplines they have, or the types of places they've come from, to really start influencing each other, or in some cases, burst each other's bubble. So how do we keep doing this? And I would love to open this up for questions, and maybe make this a bit of an interactive discussion as well. And I can continue building on that too as we go.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll come in to help facilitate. Thank you so much. It's been awesome so far. My ADC encyclopedia over here was chiming in saying Tough Turban was a best of discipline at ADC last year. So it's a really great piece. So first of all, would love to just start in with, as a cultural MacGyver yourself, can you speak to maybe some specific daily practices of how you kind of keep this practice at the heart of the work, both in how you're dealing with your folks as a team and also approaching, perhaps a brief?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a few principles I have in place. I mean, some of this also comes to me subconsciously with the benefit of having lived in 4 different continents, and constantly carrying over some of the skills I learned from the previous place, into the next place, has definitely helped me, right? And surrounding myself with people who also have very different styles of working has really helped me. Each and every one of my ECDs at work have a very different style of working. In fact, our CSO comes from a Filipino origin, right? And so she's often, putting in her own cultural influence when we are talking about things. My global CSO, Ronald, is Malaysian at heart, but he's almost a global citizen, if you will, because, he's hopped around quite a bit as well. So sometimes, it's really having the influence. Bradley, our global president, is British, right? Kate is Canadian. If I look at Joe Toppy, our CTO, is American, right? So you have many mixed influences that are constantly coming in, and how you mix and match teams to the briefs. The one thing to keep in mind is, one is talent, but the other part is the soft skills. What are the influences that they might bring to the table that might not necessarily have years of ingrained perceptions, right? So there are some iconic brands that we worked on that are very rooted, in American brands. We will sometimes put people on it that may not have even grown up here or may have just only recently moved to America. And how do you influence that? Like in my previous job, the agency was headquartered in Kansas City. So I got to interact with a lot of people from Kansas City. And that gave me an exposure into another part of America, right? And
Very different
it
part
was
of
subconscious, right? It wasn't subconscious. It was more of, it was subconscious. It wasn't here's a one-on-one on how to interact with people from different places, and I think that curiosity of wanting to learn more made a big difference, and that's one piece of advice I would say is for me that really came true at that point, because before that job, I was probably a New York creative that worked in other parts of the world. But having that exposure and understanding, some of the mindsets, some of the upbringings, if you will, of different parts of America gave me a different perspective, and since then I often say there is New York and then there's the rest of America. And I think as a creative, it's important to not limit yourself to just New York.
Absolutely. Yeah. So has in all of your travels, whether it's Kansas City or some other comparison, what's been the biggest in terms of like workplace culture and things to get used to? Like, what's been like the biggest cultural MacGyver moment for you of having to like encounter something completely different than like a work style that you're used to? And how did you get through it?
So I would say New York probably is the closest to home in Mumbai. The reason that being is the pace of Mumbai can be faster than New York. New York might be the fastest city in theory, but New York works at a completely different pace. And
just in terms of America.
Right. And I think where the types of hustles people have across the different countries that I've lived in, I think when you can mix and match that hustle, it really is very rewarding. There was an idea that my team was working on when I lived in the UK, and we wanted to almost hack the Great British Bake Off. And the team was told, we need to go live with this idea 45 minutes after the show. And the reason it was 45 minutes after the show, by the way, I arbitrarily picked 45 minutes. There was no real science behind that, to be honest. But it was 45 minutes because they had to figure out what would happen in the show to then concoct a recipe, get it tasting good, design the recipe, shoot the recipe, and get it out there in 45 minutes after the show. Jeez. And someone on the team at the time said, that's absolutely bonkers and it can't be done. Yeah. And that was the first time I may have said used the phrase, think like an Indian. And, this person went, what does that even mean? And I went, there's another Indian standing on the other side. Why don't you go and ask him? And let's see what he has to say. Maybe that mindset's completely different. and this person said, okay, with Harsh is from Mumbai, he's probably meaning if you don't figure it out, there's hundreds of people waiting to figure it out. Somebody will figure it out, right? And at that point, I just left it as that was just funny, and we let it be. Yeah. It happened again on another thing, and this time I said, think like a Brazilian. If anyone's worked with a lot of Brazilians, you'll know when you say something can't be done, they always have a friend back in Brazil who can figure it out, right? And no matter where you are, there's always a way to get it done, right? And they always know, I have this friend who can do this. I have this other friend who can do this. I've already spoken to them. They're willing to make it happen, right? And that's what I mean by when you apply some of those influences, right? You come back with magic in ways nobody expected, or it almost questions the system all the time. I wouldn't say break the system, but more questions the system of ways of working. And we've always done it this way. I think cultural MacGyverism gives you permission to not always do things the way you always did it.
Absolutely. Yeah. We have a couple audience questions, so forgive me as I turn my focus to read them out. Sydney asks, as a Black woman, a lot of the time it feels like you have to code switch at work. Have you noticed any differences in how cultural MacGyverism works in American agencies with underrepresented groups?
Yeah. So, I think this was a discussion that I had, unfortunately, last year and the year before, there was a lot in the news about Asian hate.
Mm.
And, we had to have a lot of discussions with our teams. And one of the discussions came around was, why do people not understand other cultures, in a certain market? And, part of my answer was, well, it's a little bit on us to educate people. And there was a very interesting, healthy debate about it on why do we expect others to understand our culture? Why can't they all understand it on their own? It's on the others to understand. And I was like, no one else is going to explain culture better than you if it's your own culture, right? Just taking an example, I'm here for an Indian wedding. And the minute I say that, the number of people that ask me about, oh, that goes on for 5 days. Sometimes it goes on for more, sometimes it goes on for less. And actually, every state has their own format uh, or how they do the weddings, right? And I think it's actually on us on how we educate them, because I think there is a part of this tension that sits around on, and specifically back to Sydney's question, you know the Black community has been around for years in America, but it's not new, right? But the voices are being heard only now. And a very classic example I will give you is when I first joined MRM, we did a piece of work for the client that actually was specifically for the Black community. And the team came and showed me, and the work was done before I joined the agency. I was more reviewing the case study at the end. And I actually asked the team, what was so special about the idea? And the team just went, you don't understand the idea. You don't know the history of medical practices in America and the Black community. And I was like, no, you're taking it for granted that I would know that. I didn't grow up here. I only came here in a much different stage of my life. But I do know every time I go back to India, I can't donate blood in America. I do know that because I've experienced that. And when the team actually educated me on the history, I went, the cultural nuance that got you to this idea, the idea needed to be simple because the cultural baggage from the past was so heavy. You have to put that into the case study because you're taking it for granted that everybody who's not lived in that generation, that time, or in this country knows about it.
Sure.
And I'll tell you a classic example of this is, if you look at any of the Asian award shows, like, you know, any of the entries also that come from Asia, or especially every country, at times we say Asia at large, but every country in Asia is so different, right? And that's why the work is so different, and the how you evaluate the work, the cultural knowledge is so important. Go back and look at any award-winning work from Asia. It's very often that they will put cultural context to start with to explain to you why this idea is amazing, right? Because you take the cultural context out, you go, that idea was just crazy. And that context, when you add it in, becomes amazing. So just going back in a full long-winded way back to Sydney's question, yes, there is probably a gap, but I don't think that's I don't think it's ignorance or arrogance. I think it might be, to me, it's lack of curiosity. And the only way to fulfill the lack of curiosity is actually talking about it proudly, talking about it in a way that may not be intimidating, but more creating curiosity. I'll sometimes also joke with people when they'll ask me, where do you get good Indian food? And I'm like, are you asking me because I'm Indian? And the difference between the UK and the US, most people in the US will back off thinking they just upset me. And in the UK or Australia, they'll actually say, yeah, who else am I going to ask? The other example, a fun cuisine example, is Indian Chinese. Ask any Indian person what Chinese food is, and ask someone from China, do you get this food in China? And they will go, no. But to an Indian, that is Chinese food. And the cuisine is also known Indian Chinese, right? And there are things on the menu that if you've grown up only in India, that is Chinese food for you. If you go overseas and you go to a Chinese restaurant, that's not on the menu, you will question the restaurant, even though it is the most authentic restaurant out there.
That's so funny. My friend was explaining Swedish pizza to me recently, and that's like a whole other thing on its own.
But just to that point, like we said, you just talked about Swedish pizza, which, I got to check this out. I didn't know about this.
Oh, it's wild.
But cuisine, I mean, I think chefs do a bloody good job of cultural MacGyverism today. There are so many fusion restaurants. Even the music industry is doing a great job of cultural MacGyverism. So why in the entertainment business or in the advertising business do we not do enough of it? And I don't think it's just a problem of the creative department. It is, I think, the problem of all people who are responsible for creating commercial art, if you will, art in service of growing brands. It's on all of us, whether you're a planner, a technologist, a CTO, a media person, a creative. I think it's everyone's problem, or even a producer for that matter. Our current NMR Rama producer is British with Indian origin, living in America, has been an Australian. So his mind also works very differently.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Cool. We're going to tackle one more question. I think this is a great place to end to. If you had to teach a young creative cultural MacGyverism, what 2 or 3 creative tools would you say they need?
Find different mentors. Don't just follow one mentor. And it doesn't have to be a mentor in your discipline. So if you are an art director, it doesn't have to be an art-minded or designer-minded mentor. It doesn't even have to be a creative, right? That would be one thing for sure. Like, find a range of mentors till you figure out what type of person or what type of talent you want to be, irrespective of discipline. Another one is travel at a younger age. As you get older, it's going to get harder and harder to go immigrate to different places. I think there are 2 different things. Travel is a very broad word in that sense. I think holidays and just traveling around is one thing, but I think if you have the ability and the freedom to go live in other countries, live in different cities, embrace the cultures that you walked into, try and live like that local market versus trying to say, I'm here only for 2 years and I don't need to embrace it, because it will help you a few years later. Like, I'll give you an example. Years ago, my mom forced me into speech and drama. I hated it as a kid. I just hated it. And there was also another attempt of me going into law because my whole family is lawyers. So I was influenced with a lot of legal talk over dinner, over lunch, a lot of, who their clients were when they would talk to each other. And that was one of the reasons I ran away from law. All these years later in America, it helps me talk to the legal team and to lawyers to save every single idea, right? So to me, cultural MacGyverism even came there, of having influences from the lawyers I grew up with to saving the ideas in creativity, right? And I would say, don't limit yourself to just looking at ads. Like, look at where creativity is happening outside as well, because the more senior you get, the more your job becomes about protecting and scaffolding the work that your teams are working so hard to come in with. And if you are a true believer of cultural MacGyverism, and if you are setting up teams and you're hiring teams that come with diverse mindsets, are not just going on autopilot of how it's being done, it's going to become your job to protect their talents and their minds, to not just become part of a system, but always be challenging a system.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that was 3, right? I think that was 3.
I think we're at 3. Yeah, I actually really loved that last point. I feel like the more I talk to our members and the creatives in the community, it's that varied experience before advertising that really ends up leading to really rich work, either in the creative itself or just how people are like forming their paths. And also a big believer in travel and living elsewhere, because it'll just completely change.
Another thing Adam, just to add to that, something you said just reminded me, there was another thing. I used to actually teach a word school, this program in Australia. And anyone could join. The fees were really low. It wasn't an official degree from a university. It was actually run by the advertising industry, called Award. And, creative directors, senior creatives would, give up their time once a week to actually review people's work. And at the end of 13 weeks, you would have a portfolio. But where I was getting to was I would actually be meeting students because it wasn't necessarily about coming from ad school. It was about getting your entry into the ad industry, right? It was one of the ways to get, and I think the fees back then were very affordable. They were not, I mean, it was under 2,000 Aussie dollars compared to, what you would pay in a university. And what I noticed, which was surprising, it's really hard to get into because a lot of people apply to it and only few get in. Sure. But what I noticed was the ones that were getting in, like there was a year when I had somebody who was a carpenter, a plumber, a lawyer, a graphic designer, and there were some other people, like actually somebody who had come from the fire department, right, were my students, right? So, and they came up with ideas that were so different than I was seeing from the ad school students, right? Yeah. And I think that had a lot to do with, they didn't know what the right answer was. They didn't know what is right and wrong. They just went with the knowledge they had, the brief they had, and the instincts they had, right? And very often, like my old partner, I think he was a plumber at one point in Australia. And if you actually go analyze Aussie work, you will see how there is no real formula about Aussie work. And I think a lot of these influences are coming from how people get into the industry there versus in some other countries where, I've had many discussions around getting into the industry because you had privilege of going through certain universities to get into design school. I mean, it's funny, design school costs a lot, but the industry pays much lesser, right? And so how do you find that balance between the two? Or would you be open to hiring people who may not have gone through formal ad school?
Sure.
So, that's some of the things on ways to break around, how to continue to embrace MacGyverism.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation, and I appreciate you being here on your vacation. Enjoy yourself, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. And thank you for everyone who tuned in. Really appreciate it. Hope it influenced something, and I hope to meet more MacGyvers who are mashing up culture.
Amazing. Cool. Thanks so much, Harsh.
Thank you. Bye.
I'm so excited to introduce you to our next guest, Young Gun winner and member Talia Cotton. Talia Cotton is a designer, coder, and educator, and is recognized as a leading specialist in the intersection of design and technology. In 2023, she founded Cotton, a creative agency pursuing purposeful design work with code. Talia also teaches intro and advanced coding at Parsons School of Design. And before Cotton, Talia led data-driven and algorithmic design on 2 teams at Pentagram while running an independent design and code practice. Her clients include Google Arts and Culture, the New York Times, the Gates Foundation, and MIT. Talia was named Responsible Designer to Watch by GDUSA and was awarded the Young Guns Award for Creative Professionals Under 30. In addition to being recognized by the One Club, she's also been recognized by the TDC, Fast Company, and It's Nice That. And she's inspired audiences at the International Google Visual Design Summit, OFFF, in Tel Aviv, and Future London Academy, among many others. As impressive as all of that is, just wait until you see her work. Let's take a look.
I'm Talia Cotton, and I'm a designer and coder. I believe designing with code not only opens up new possibilities for the visual outputs of design, but it enables us to respond to today's critical and complex design prompts. Prompts such as how to make design unbiased, represent everyone, be data-driven, community-driven, and even evolve with the times. In my work, I explore how technology as a design medium addresses these questions, and I believe it is our key to doing so authentically, inherently, and strategically.
So amazing. Hey, Talia, welcome to the show.
Hi, Adam.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. It was so cool to see. I've met you in coffees and in parties, but it was so cool to see you be a podcaster. You're so good at it.
Thank you. I feel like super self-conscious about it, but I appreciate that.
Okay, you're great.
Thank you. Well, I mean, talk about being amazing at what you do. Your work is so inspiring and so incredible. You describe it as purposeful design with code. Can you dive into that a bit more?
Sure. So I think right now there's sort of like a new peak in the design world where people are finally getting a little bit excited by what technology can do for design. But I think so much of what we see right now is very experimental. It's kind of like it looks really cool. There's like pixels and particles moving around the screen, but it's rare. There's still kind of like that disconnect of like, oh, I get what I'm looking at and I understand what this purpose is.
Right.
Which is kind of like the antithesis to design as we know it. Design is like this intentional thing where like everything has a purpose, and that's what we do as designers. So I have a background in branding and traditional design, and I also love coding. So in working with code, I've in the last 5 years or so that I've worked with it, I've sort of realized that coding can create new possibilities for design. Firstly, I think the more obvious one is in form and in function. So things like coding can make design adaptive, automated, data-driven, generative, interactive, like all these things that like suddenly there's like new ways of seeing and feeling design. And that's great. And I think sort of already seeing that as an option is great. But where I'm most passionate about is that with using those new possibilities in form and function, you suddenly have new possibilities in meaning and in impact. So because suddenly coding can be controlled by other people, suddenly design can be just a little bit more individual than it would be if you're just representing it with like colors and shapes. Some of the themes that I've seen in the work that I'm doing just in the last couple of years are that coding can start to make design a little bit more unbiased. I think so. Some of the themes in that little reel that you just played has a little bit unbiased. We have community driven. We have again individual, evolve over time. These are just the beginnings of what I'm seeing is possible. But my goal is to kind of like figure out what more themes are possible when using code as a design.
That's amazing. It's like so beyond my comprehension, and I am just enamored by like your ability to translate it. So talk to me about how you got here. What was your path in getting to being a designer, coder?
Oh, we have like 15 minutes right now. So I think my path to being a designer coder is actually very similar to a lot of designers out there, in the sense that I get the sense that a lot of designers choose that career path because it's like it's a creative industry that's also like the most logical. It's like either that or architecture, but architecture takes 6 years of a degree and design is just 4. So it's like, yeah, I'll choose that one. I grew up in a creative home. Both my parents were musicians. I was homeschooled here in New York and we went to museums, just really creative upbringing. But I also loved math and science and English and all of that, liberal arts stuff. When it came time to apply for college, I said, well, I grew up by broke musicians and I don't want to be broke. So I'm going to study business and psychology. I did that for 2 years. Loved it, but still wasn't sort of getting that like creative side of things. Transferred to Parsons, where I was like, I'm going to give up all of my science mindedness and I'm just going to move things around the page and I'm going to be okay with that. And I took my first and only coding class at Parsons at the time. I think that was sort of the very beginnings of people thinking that something could happen with code. And from there, it was a lot of it was self-taught. I think like I fell in love with it in that first class, but I really just spent a lot of my free time playing around with coding and how it can be applied to design. I remember all of my school projects, not all of them, but many of my school projects would be using code, even if the teacher didn't ask for it. So I was really trying to use it as a design medium. It was getting critiqued as a design project. So with that, I was sort of able to start integrating the two of them from like a good design standpoint.
Oh, cool. Was there, like you mentioned in that first year, you started to fall in love. Was there like a particular moment or project or like just general like exercise that you were like, wow, this is really powerful and exciting. And I know that this is like kind of unlocking the future for me?
Yeah, actually. So I didn't get to sort of like the realization of what code can do for design until much later in my practice. I think for the first couple years, it was very experimental. But I remember the first time that I actually I knew that I fell in love with code. It's a very distinctive day in my mind. It was my birthday. It was about a month and a half into, my birthday's in November. So it was about a month and a half into my first semester of studying code. And I remember I said, okay, for my birthday, I want to create my very first kind of like self-created code thing that wasn't like an assignment from my coding class. So I went to the farmer's market next door to my school. I got myself a big bottle of alcoholic cider because it was my birthday.
Yeah, of
I
course.
I went to the computer lab at school because I didn't have my own computer at the time. And I spent the day drinking cider and coding a thing. And the result, it was silly. It was like I liked to have fun in all my projects. I was very stupid in my work. And the final result was this game called Give the Cat a Pizza, where it's just this never-ending game where you drag a pizza to the cat and you go over and over. And there are many different cats and many different outer space worlds that this thing happens in. But I think that was the first time that I did something by myself. I realized that it's fun and it's silly, and there's like it, and I shared that with people, and people's like they would light up when they see it. And I think that was like the first time that I said, well, there's something here. It's silly, but that's pretty much it.
That's
And
awesome.
I use that story when I talk to students and when I talk to audiences. I use that story as just like an indication of like coding is very daunting. Coding is very scary. It seems like just numbers and letters on the page. But I think the most important thing for those of us who are just diving in or get overwhelmed is just to remember, like, just have fun, do something silly, do something really ridiculous, like do something with private parts, like just do something silly, and then you'll be a better coder just because you're having fun with it.
Yeah, I definitely have like done some stalking and seen Give the Cat a Pizza, and it's very fun. So anybody out there, go find it and have some fun. But and you maybe just like kind of touched on this question, but what would you say is the biggest myth around coding that you'd like to bust here today?
Okay. Well, I already said the fun one. Coding is fun. You should do it. It's not such a myth. I think that one's a little bit more wider known. But the most important lesson that I've ever learned about coding, I learned it about like 3.5 years in, or 4 years in. I was already working at Pentagram, and I was doing a project for MIT where we were doing like this really interesting coded typeface that was going to be part of their exhibitions and never ended up going through. But this is, mind you, this is like 4 years into my career. I've already had several jobs as a professional developing full-on websites, doing the front end, the back end. I did all my extra stuff on the side. And I think the most important thing for people to know is during that time, I still had a lot of self-doubt. I was still like, well, I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just, figuring this thing out. Like, I didn't have any mentors because no one really did what I was doing. I didn't know what was right and what was wrong. I just was really just figuring it out. And I met with the head MIT guy on the project. He was like this developer, and he taught coding and all that stuff. And I was showing him the project, and he said, oh my God, this is so great. Thank you. Can you make this code open source so that our community can play with it and see it? And I said, no, man, like, why would anyone want to see this code? Like, the cool thing is the final product. Like, I'll show them the typeface, but like the code, it's ugly. It's just letters and numbers. Who cares? This is the myth that's busted. This changed everything for me. He was totally triggered, and he said, no, dude. He didn't say dude, it was very professional. He said, no, Talia, the code has a soul. The way that you write your code is reflective of how you learned it and how you think. I think there's a lot of problem solving in coding and figuring things out, and there's no right answer. I feel like with coding, people think that it's like, oh, 1 + 1 always equals 2, but there are many different ways to get to 2, like you could do 2 - 0 = 2. That's my metaphor. But the idea here is that there's no right way to do coding. That's the first thing. But second thing is that how you do coding is a beautiful reflection of yourself, and there's beauty in the code itself. That's the myth, and now it's busted.
Busted. That's amazing. I love that. Well, in our time left, I want to make sure we kind of glaze over this in your bio, but congratulations on launching Cotton, your new agency. It's so amazing. I'm just like so excited to see what you do with that. It's been just a few months since you launched. So what's been the most exciting development or experience that's come out of launching your own baby?
So I'm less than 2 months old. Or my baby is less than 2 months old, and I cannot tell you right now. I think the good news is that I'm always busy. My plate is always overflowing. And I'm loving this whole thing. I'm loving this process. I do aim to build a team, get people to work for me, and I'm definitely on that journey. I just think going into this, I knew that I had zero expectations. I said, I don't know what I'm going to learn and what this is going to be like, but I'm starting with a blank mind. And things have happened so fast so far that I think I haven't had a moment to pause and reflect on the past couple months. But have me on Morning Buzz in a year and I'll give you a better answer.
Deal. Perfect.
Cool.
It's still exciting and going to be awesome. And so as you're like dreaming of the future, is there a type of work that you'd like to tackle in the future? Like whether it's like addressing a topic or type of brand or project format, like what are you hoping to sink your teeth into?
So the type of work will be all design with a focus in branding. That's just general, and a lot of digital work because a lot of design right now is digital. Just to sort of make this conversation go full circle, the type of work that I'm the most interested in is the work that allows me to the work that has like complex abstract themes that allows me to explore new ways that coding can kind of like address them from like a really meaningful standpoint, not just from the visual, not just like how it looks, but really from like metaphorically how the code can answer that. So that could be anything. That could be like a political organization that's trying to tackle something complicated, and I could see, okay, how can code figure this out? So that's the work that I love the most.
Cool. Amazing. Well, we're just at time. And Talia, I just want to say, like, you're so inspiring, and I'm a huge fan. I can't wait to see what you do with Cotton. I know it'll be really incredible. So thank you again for being here today and sharing your story. I'm sure everyone else is super inspired.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you. Have a great one. Man, she's amazing. So friends, that's our show. Thank you again for joining. If there's anything you'd like to see on Morning Buzz, or if you're interested in more information on the One Club, please explore morningbuzz.oneclub.org. There's a contact form that'll put you in direct contact with me, and also a link out to the One Club. You can even join to be a member if you are not one. I'd love to make sure that we're serving up exactly what you're looking for. Morning Buzz will be back with an all-new episode in 2 weeks on April 20th. Our friends at Mono will be sharing their thoughts on why ambition is not a dirty word. So I'll see you then. Thanks so much and have a great day.